Happy Purim, everyone. Post-Purim, but I'm still dressed for Purim today. I'm wearing my holiday garb in honor of Purim, and I was discussing with Rod about it, and we decided that I would be talking about Purim today. Even though it's, well, that was last week, this is this week, and most Jewish mothers have forgotten all about Purim now. They're headed towards Pesach. At this point, it's Passover. You know, it's pretty scary because on Purim, the house is full of Haman and candy and all these things that are chametz, that are leavened, you know, and it's a virtual nightmare for the balabusta. You know, it's a virtual nightmare for the woman of the house because she's already thinking about, oh my gosh, look at the mess they're making, and I have to get ready for Passover. So you know, maybe the woman of the house has to have a couple of drinks on Purim also to kind of loosen up and make sure she doesn't get upset about the house getting full of hamantashen and crumbs on the floor and everything like that, because we're already heading towards Passover. But all jokes aside, it is common practice that many homes immediately after Purim begin preparing. The woman of the house begins thinking about Passover and planning preparations. Being that there are just 30 days between Purim and Passover, the Talmud tells us that from the time that the month of Adar begins, that is the month where Purim takes place in the Hebrew calendar, it's we are marbim b'simcha, we increase in happiness. And interestingly enough, Rashi there explains in the Talmud, he's one of the commentaries on the page, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, he explains that the reason we increase is because Adar is the month before Nisan, the month in which Passover falls out. And so we're already heading towards the miracles of Passover, so it's time to start preparing by being joyous. So you'd think it would be about Purim, but Rashi sees it as being about Passover, which seems to imply somehow that there's a relationship between Purim and Passover. But really, Purim and Passover are very, very different. They're really so different that you really need to scratch your head when you think about that comparison of there being some type of bridge between the two, and you really need to try to find it. And the reason I say that is, yeah, sure, in a cursory type of observation, one might say Purim is a miracle, Passover is miracles, one miracle, two miracles. What's the difference? We're talking about a lot of miracles. Okay, another miracle. You know, they tried to destroy us. We had a miracle. Let's eat, right? I mean, you know, well, it's another miracle. But they're very, very different. Very, very different. You know, to me, one of the most mysterious things about the Megillah is something that's really out there in the open and discussed by the sages, and that is that the name of God is not mentioned there. Not once is God's name mentioned in the book of Esther. And, you know, there are reasons given for that. Why is God's name not mentioned? But what I find strange is that what is the purpose of the book of Esther? Why is it read on Purim? It's read in order that what? That we should publicize the miracle. The miracle should be widely known, and we should appreciate the miracle. Wouldn't it be a lot easier to do that? Why don't we just spell it out? I mean, what is the secret? Why doesn't it say there, for example, and God put into the mind of Achashverosh that he should agree with Esther and hate, you know, and turn around his opinions towards Haman. It doesn't say that. It's never mentioned once. I mean, if you read it without preconceptions, you could potentially read it as some political drama. You could tell, you know, Hollywood would tell a completely different story than I was brought up on. Totally different story. You know, Mordechai is kind of like, Mordechai could potentially be portrayed as a kind of a naive pietist. You know, he refuses to bow, even though Haman is so powerful. Haman gets crazy mad, and because, you know, Mordechai just won't walk the walk, he decides to kill everybody. I mean, why didn't the Mordechai? I mean, may Mordechai's honor forgive me, and I don't mean this. I mean this as a question, but the truth is, we could ask, because traditionally we understand that the reason why Haman was able to come to such power and pass a decree to annihilate the Jewish people had something to do with something the Jewish people did wrong, right? Something must have been done wrong. There must have been some type of deficiency in their faith, in their actions, and something, and we'll get there and discuss it. But yet that is not mentioned in the story. Never is it mentioned the Jews sinned, they did A, B, C, and D. Nowhere. So God's name isn't mentioned. We don't know what the sin is. And in fact, again, if you read the story, you may come to the mistaken conclusion that Mordechai is some kind of naive, I don't know, he's kind of, yeshivish, he's kind of in Jewish, Yiddish parlance, he's so religious, he doesn't understand the world at all, he doesn't know what's going on, and he didn't know how to deal with Haman, and then Haman, gets crazy angry, and look what this resulted in. Now we're all in trouble, But I don't even want to go farther before I say that that's totally wrong, and that Mordechai was a hero, and Mordechai refused to bow. The Megillah says, the Book of Esther says he refused to bow or prostrate himself in front of Haman. And it is clear that the Megillah is trying to talk to us about his courage, about this refusal. The Talmud tells us that Haman had declared himself a god. There's another opinion that says that he used to wear an idol around his neck. And Mordechai refused to bow to that image, refused to bow to Haman. So whether he declared himself a deity or wore a deity around his neck, the result was the same, that all the other officers and ministers bowed to him, but Mordechai refused, despite any consequences. So there's no question that Mordechai is the hero of the diaspora. Mordechai is a paradigm of how a Jew should behave in the diaspora, and furthermore, really how any human being who's on the Jewish side of the equation needs to behave. Because when we're in exile, so the majority culture is hostile, and there may be situations in which, people tap you on the shoulder and say, "Come on, just do it. Not a big deal. Just fit in. Just fit in. Don't make such a big deal about it." But he refused to do so in any way. It's interesting that later on, there's another language that we find in regards to Mordechai, that it says that after the decree was passed, it says that Mordechai loy kam v'loy zah mimenu. Mordechai did not rise, and he did not move, he did not tremble, depending on how you interpret the word zah, but Mordechai did not react in any way to Haman, even after the decree was passed. He didn't respond. Mordechai was a stalwart, a man of the strongest faith. Nothing could move him. And he was right there out in the open. It was written on his truth is, I love to have it on a t-shirt. I consider these words some of the most, really a byword of the Jewish people right now. Mordechai lo yichra v'lo yishtachaveh. Mordechai did not bow down. He did not prostrate himself. This is the key. This always, in order to be strong and to stand with bravery against those forces that are hostile to Judaism, and not to give in one iota. Could be that that's what has to do with Mordechai's name. Mordechai, in the name Mordechai, there's 3 letters, Mem, Resh, Daled. That makes up the word Mered. Mered means rebellion. So Mordechai rebelled against the Gentile culture he lived in. He refused to bow to it. There was a spirit of rebellion against it in him. Now, what about the last two letters? I just want to preface that I just thought of this numerical myself, so, you know, if it doesn't work out, don't worry. You just blame me, but it doesn't say it in any, I didn't find it in any sources. It's just something that I thought of myself. Again, merid means rebellion. Now, the last two letters are Chaf, Yud. Mordechai. What is the Kai? Kaf, Yud. Now, the numerical value of Kaf is 20. The numerical value of Yud is 10. That makes 30. Now, the word for heart is Lev. Lev is, Lamed is 30. Bet is 2. So that means that the last two letters of Mordechai's name is a heart minus 2. But if you put the two letters of the Kai together, that adds 2. That's the full heart. That's Lev. And sometimes in gematria and numericals, we can do that. We can add up the value of the letters and also the number of letters. So that tells you that that even though it wasn't always visible, he did it often in a subtle way, a little passive aggressive. But Mordechai, in his heart, he was a rebel against the culture he lived in. He was a counterculturist. I can imagine that Mordechai was kind of like a Hasidic Jew. You know, he walked around in Jewish garb, but he mixed in the royal courts. He went there as is. And he kept Jewish custom as is, and he was ashamed of no one. But obviously the key to that has to be in a person's heart. It has to be internalized. At the same time, obviously, Mordechai did have respect for the royal house. He had to follow its protocol as long as it didn't go contrary to Judaism. So that's why there was rebellion in his heart, but obviously, externally, he understood that there was a requirement, and even according to Torah, there was a requirement to give respect to the king. And we know that Rashi tells us that Moses, when he spoke to Pharaoh, he often, when he spoke things that were derogatory, he spoke in third person as to give respect to the king. So even Moses speaking to Pharaoh, Pharaoh being the great nemesis of the children of Israel, he spoke to him with respect in honor of his position as a monarch of a nation. It's a very, very important lesson that on the one hand, we can be against someone. It can even be a degree of hatred, but there can also be respect at the same time. It's a very nuanced approach. And we have to, on the one hand, realize if we see in others certain detestable qualities, we have to recognize those. We also have to recognize positive qualities if they exist. Not to only pick up on one thing and not the other, but to fully recognize and to be fully cognizant of everything. So we have a book that doesn't mention God's name. We have a book that doesn't mention the sins of the Jewish people. We also have a book that begins in the most bizarre way. It starts off talking about the greatness of Achashverosh. It talks about how great this Persian king was, how he ruled over 127 provinces or countries. And how does the Megillah end? It ends on a very similar note. You know, I don't know. I was looking at it this year, and I just thought it was absolutely bizarre. You know, we get to the point, and if you go all the way to the end of the book of Esther, you'll find that in the last chapter, actually, no, it's in chapter 9, the last section. Well, that's the end of the Megillah. It says that's the end of the book. It says that Esther wrote down everything and that they took upon themselves to keep these holidays. And it was happily ever after the end. But no, it's not the end. Then it goes over to say that Achashverosh, he placed taxes on the islands of the sea. But what does this have to do with anything? And then it says that all his greatness and his bravery and also the appointment of Mordechai was written in the down in the historical books of the kings of Persia and Media. I mean, what does this have to do with anything? It's just thrown in after. I mean, it's anticlimactic. We just finished the story, but we're not finished the story. It's like an epilogue, really to nowhere. We finished the story, and we're talking about Achashverosh again. It's bizarre. And then the last sentence, it says that the Mordechai, he became the closest advisor to the king, and he was a great, he was well known and famous among the Jewish people, and so on and so forth, and as concerned for their welfare and their posterity. So we end with Mordechai, but the funny thing is it's kind of like Mordechai in reference as related to Achashverosh. I mean, the story is over, and we're kind of a little bit backing. We come back a little bit, talking about Mordechai. So, this incredible miracle happens. Everything turns upside down. Haman convinces the king to issue this decree, total extermination of the Jewish people in one day. Along comes Esther, and she's secretly a Jewish queen. Mordechai tells her, we got to do something. She says, fast 3 days. They fast 3 days. She goes to the king, and she invites Haman. They have this party. They drink together. King gets jealous. Why is Haman at this party? 2 parties with this Haman. What's he doing here? She asks, he's very curious, Esther, why did you make these? What did you want to ask me? Why are you making these parties, basically? And she says, it's about him. He's the enemy. He wants to destroy us. And Achashverosh acts stupid, like he doesn't know what's going on. He says, who's this that thought of this, that wants to exterminate you? Oh, it's this evil nemesis of the Jewish people, Haman. And everything turns upside down. Haman is hanged. His sons are hanged. And the day that was supposed to be the day of extermination turns out to be the day of defense of the Jewish people, in which they're able to attack their enemies, and all the nations all around are full of fear of the Jewish people, and Mordechai becomes the closest confidant of the king, and then they establish the 13th day as a fast day. That was a day when the wars were fought, and the 14th day is established as a day of festival, and in Shushan they fought 2 days, 13 and 14 of Adar. So they had 2 days, and then on the 15th day is the day of festival in Shushan. What should happen next, everyone? What should be the next thing? The next thing is, and that's what happened, and they did it every year, and it was very wonderful, happily ever after, the end, next story. But that's not what happens. Then we go on to say, oh, and by the way, Achashverosh, he was a very great king, and he laid taxes upon the islands, and and all his stories about his greatness are in his books and his history. You know what? If I didn't know better, I would think that this verse is trying to tell us that this whole story is to tell you how amazing Achashverosh was. Think about it. Look at it. How are we ending? And if you want to know more about the greatness of Achashverosh and all the Persian kings, it's in the books. It's in their history books. So if I didn't have a tradition, and I was reading the story, you would almost think that we're trying to say that what an amazing king Achashverosh is. What a superhero. He made this mistake. He agreed with Haman, but then he saw his mistake. He saved the Jews. He's our savior. He's yay. It's kind of like he's basically the Donald Trump of the Persian kingdoms there, Did these amazing things for the Jews. He's basically unbelievable. Look what he did. That seems to be the implication of the last paragraph. The last paragraph seems to imply that Achashverosh was a hero here. But traditionally, this isn't how we look at it. So, so we have to really get behind this, because Passover is just the opposite. Passover is a time of open miracles. in which the Bible explicitly says again and again, God did this, and God did that. God brought this plague, and he brought the next plague. And Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, in the name of God, release my firstborn son Israel. Right? Again and again. And Pharaoh says, I don't know God. But God's name is all over the place. In fact, before we even begin the story, what does the Almighty say to Moses? What is your name? So we're talking about, my name is the four-letter name, the ineffable name. Tell that to the children of Israel. This is my memory from generation to generation. This is my remembrance. Zichri l'dar dar. So the name of God is all over the place. And here nothing. So obviously this is a book for us. There's no better book for us than the story of Purim. Because in our world, God's hidden. In our world, we don't see God. We don't feel often. He seems very absent. As soon as you walk out of the synagogue, seems like God, like the song said, that it seems like he packed his bags and he went someplace else. I can't even imagine how they must have felt after the temple was destroyed, and how Jewish communities must have felt during so many terrible persecutions. As the verse says, Jewish people will ask, they'll say, this happened to me because God is not in my midst. There's a feeling that God is absent, not present. And that's a terrible state of affairs. But it's also a terrible falsehood. I mean, why do I say it's a terrible state of affairs? The problem is our problem. The problem is we can't connect. You know, the problem is that we're bound in a relationship with God. The problem is that he's our source of life, and yet we can't feel that, we can't sense that. That's the thing about when the name is missing, when the name being silent. So we're living in a place where God's providence is very, very hidden, and it doesn't stimulate a reaction on our part. Look, God is everywhere. And as we said many, many times, God is the creator. God is the source of being. He's brought everything into being from nothingness. So it's not just that he, made, for example, brought grass out of the earth. It's not like a potter with clay. There was no substance. There was no rules. There was no nothing. So, the point of what I'm trying to say is that God's presence is always here. The problem really is from our side, that we're unable to grasp it. And that's a terrible problem. Because we're here for just the opposite reason. We're here in order to have a relationship with him. And how do we go about doing that? How can we create what doesn't exist? What I mean to say is, how can we make ourselves feel something or have a reality that we don't feel? Can you make ourselves feel something we don't feel? And some people may be blessed with a certain feeling of connection or inspiration from time to time. But if we look a little deeper, then we'll know that, in fact, it's very superficial in many ways. And that as we go through life and we go through different challenges, we may notice that when the pedal hits the metal, we very easily forget that reality. I mean, for example, if something goes wrong in our lives, for an example, how do we respond? If we have a crisis in our lives, if somebody gets sick, how do we respond? This is a good example. Do we turn to prayer immediately, or we immediately turn to try to find the right doctor? I'm not saying you don't have to find. You do have to find the best doctor you can. But the question is, what is our real first reactions? And what can really be expected? What can be expected in a world where God is so hidden? It's almost like the question is, what do you want from us? What is it that we're supposed to do with this situation? We're brought up in a culture where God's absent. It's not a part of the human consciousness. And really the opposite is true, that God has been so removed and man has taken over so much that there's a certain feeling, it's a kind of a two-pronged type of consciousness. One is that man has the power to control everything and change everything. And if there's something that man can't control, then we're rudderless. Then there's nothing that can change and nothing control it. And basically we're just at the mercy of fate. We're at the mercy of the natural powers of things. There's nothing that we can do. So we're forced to say something here. We're forced to say that Purim is a very special holiday. Purim is a day infused with the power to see through the hiddenness of everything. In other words, what I'm trying to argue is that the reason God's name isn't mentioned in the Megillah is because we don't need to. Because the power of Purim is that it gives the person, if it's a heavenly instilled inspiration, so to speak. It's a heavenly given consciousness that gives the person the ability to realize that behind everything, even behind the forces that are rebelling against God, God is there and God's in control. That's why the Megillah begins with Achashverosh and ends with Achashverosh, because the Megillah is all about Achashverosh, which is a contradiction, because Achashverosh was a rebel against God. He was an idolater. He was a man that was a hedonist. What does Achashverosh do? He throws a huge bar fest for 180 days. They're drinking and getting drunk for over a year, and then everybody joins them for 7 days. And by the way, this party is very egalitarian. Everybody's invited. Everybody can drink whatever they want, how much they want. Everybody's okay. Everybody's the same. You see, in many ways, Achashverosh's rule was very similar to that of today. Achashverosh dealt with a problem that we have in the modern world, and that is, how do we get different ethnicities to get along? How do we do it? He ruled over 127 different countries with different religions, different languages. It says so expressly in the book of Esther, in the Megillah, many times, that different decrees were sent out in all different languages. So Achashverosh was dealing with a very, very modern problem. There's nothing new under the sun. This isn't something new that we're first dealing with today. This is something that was dealt with a long time ago. So what's our solution today? What was Achashverosh's solution? A very similar solution. Achashverosh's solution said, what is the common denominator between everyone? Common denominator, he said, is the body. Food, drink, pleasure. Everybody likes that. Who doesn't like that? Who doesn't like, great food, a beachfront vacation? Everybody, who's not going to? Everybody likes it. In other words, the same thing. We have today something everybody can agree upon, the American dream, to have a house and a car and, have the best things you can get in terms of possessions. Who can disagree with that? Whatever language you speak, whatever church, synagogue, Hindu temple you go to, mosque, everybody wants the same thing. So Achashverosh had a very, very similar idea. He said, our culture is hedonism. Pleasure. Everybody can connect through pleasure. That was his answer. That was his religion. His real religion was hedonism. And he covered it with a facade of peacefulness. This is how we get people to get along. We all just come together and enjoy together. So we love each other. Everybody gets along. So many Jews went along with this. Sounds familiar? They said, you know, this is a way for us to get together. We have to learn to get along with others. And they went to the party. They enjoyed the party. And then things got out of hand. And then Ahasuerus brought out his idol, and everyone bowed to the idol. So ostensibly it was all about pleasure, but then there was this level of idolatry that developed from that. So it started out as ostensibly to be about peace and brotherhood, was hedonism and then idolatry. And the Talmud tells us that many of the Jews at that time, they bowed down to this idol. Now, although you could say that maybe they had to because it was Ahasuerus and in the king's court, but that was the outcome. That was the result of this phony form of brotherhood. Because in the end, the glorification of physical pleasures doesn't bring people together. It actually breaks people apart. The Tanya explains that the thing that brings people together is their spiritual root. The understanding that from the spiritual side of things, we're all united. We all come from one source. We're clearly all separate bodies and entities. Every body has its own desires for itself. The body is what makes us separate, not unified. It's the body that causes discord and finally bloodshed. It's the spiritual aspect of things that brings things together. If we know we all have one Father and we all have one Creator, but not just we have one Creator, but we're actually bound up and that's our root and that's where we really exist is there, then we can get together. Bodies can't really get together. It's a facade. We get together each for our own self-interest. I'm together with you because I want to be left alone myself. But what happens when we're in a situation where that just doesn't work anymore? There isn't enough, for example, resources for everyone. Then the good times are over. Then everybody's for themselves. That's the body. That's the body. And that brews discontent. So, as the story similarly seems to go, we find an interesting phenomenon. We first find that Haman has he seems like he's a real moralist. The first time we encounter Haman is when he's one of the advisors to the king. And the question is, what do we do with Vashti? What did Vashti do? Again, you have this kind of equality going on. I'm not going to say it's a feminism because there wasn't a feminism, but Vashti was also getting drunk and she was having a bachelorette party there. She had her own drinking party with the girls. Who knows what was going on there? I can only imagine. And the king calls on her to appear with in the king's crown, and the sages say with the crown, with nothing else. And Vashti refuses to appear. I guess she was having too much fun at her bachelorette party. She didn't want to join in on this. But in any event, I guess things got really too much even for her. She, despite the fact she was also indulging. So what did Ahasuerus say to her? She basically said, look, come on, it's all part of this agenda. Get on the board. You got to get on the ball game. You got to get part of the team. You know, you appear, you know, as a front page in Playboy, you know, in my court. And this is going to help bring brotherhood. I mean, this is all for the good, you know. But Vashti didn't think so. No, she knew that was a terrible disrespect towards her and humiliation, and she wouldn't come. So we see what the end brings. I mean, it's interesting. Right there in the Megillah, we see that the result of this approach was something that did immediately infringe on his own integrity of his own family, his own wife. So, but Haman comes along and he's going to set things right, and he speaks up for the sanctity of the family. Haman. What does Haman say? Haman says, "King, no, you got to get rid of Vashti. Why? Because she didn't listen. And if all the women hear that the queen didn't listen to the king and she got away with it, what's going to happen? And all the women are just going to basically rebel against their husbands, and basically the integrity of the marriage unit is going to fall apart. So therefore she must be punished." And King Ahasuerus and all his advisors very much, they liked this idea. They thought he was right. So it's interesting, when we first see Haman, he's kind of, he seems like a ultra conservative here. He's saying that, we have to make sure that women know their place, and that a woman should be a proper wife to consider her husband, etc., etc. But at the same time, it's very hypocritical, because look at the situation. I mean, what was it that she was refusing to do? She was refusing, actually, she's the one who was promoting the integrity of the family. She was saying that, I'm your wife. There's a limit to everything. This is out of control. I'm not some type of harlot to be put on display here. Not only that, she was the queen. She was actually a direct descendant from the Babylonian and Syrian kings, not him. But again, to look at it from our perspective, put that point aside, again, it's kind of this completely hypocritical, lie that Memucan was promoting here. He's talking about presenting the supposed affront of Vashti as something that would undermine the family unit, when really it was Ahasuerus' act that undermined the family unit. I guess he wasn't going to tell the king that, you could argue, but in essence, actually, what he did undermined things, because basically what he was saying is that, it depends how far you went in understanding this decree. In other words, if someone just took the decree in a vacuum and said, okay, well, wives need to listen to their husbands no matter what. Okay, that's, you can argue about that, but I understand your point. But look at it a little deeper. I mean, what did the husband ask? This is something that a husband is forbidden to ask. There are limits to everything. This is not acceptable. And to promote that and say that in such a circumstance, yeah, this is how far it goes, that a husband can turn his wife into a harlot. This is promoting promiscuity. This is not promoting the home. So it's so fascinating how we see, even in those days, how much hypocrisy, and to what a degree wicked people said one thing and meant something else. He's supposedly promoting the family when he's promoting harlotry. So that's how we first meet Haman. And it's interesting because he's very much like the evil inclination. How does the snake begin the conversation? He says, first he talks to Chava, he says, if you eat that, you'll be like God. Well, that's not such a bad thing. If you be like God, maybe that's a good thing. Right? And this is how the evil inclination begins his conversation with us. He starts telling us, you really have to. Well, you have to, cheat your investors because your wife, you need the money. You have to pay for tuition for your children to go to college. And, you have to make the sacrifice. You'll figure it out later. Start making all kinds of excuses. All kinds of excuses. In every single case where a person goes down the wrong path, it starts with an excuse. It starts based on something positive, where the person is supposedly promoting some type of good moral thing, some type of ethic. And so amazingly, we see that Haman is exactly this type of a person. He's first appears on the scene, ostensibly, supposedly promoting, the integrity and order in the family and so on and so forth. However, from the view of this being the drama, clearly Achashverosh understood it to be an opportunity for him to fully seize power, and an opportunity maybe to get rid of Vashti and get someone else, which is what he did. So we see throughout the Megillah, again, this emphasis on the physical. When there's the advice, the counsel given to Achashverosh to find a wife, what is he looking for? He's only looking for one thing. He's looking for the prettiest girl. That's it. Nothing else. That's the prettiest girl. So again, hedonism. So from this hedonism somehow develops this terrible anti-Semitism. A situation develops that Haman and Achashverosh decide that we have to annihilate the Jewish people completely. But let's take a step back, though, for a moment. Before we get to that, what happens in the story? Excuse me. We're introduced to Mordechai. And we're introduced to Esther. They seem to be two people that are paradigms of Jewish heroes in the exile. Mordechai HaYehudi, Mordechai the Jew, and Esther HaMalka, and Esther the Queen. And they're two very different personalities, but two clear paradigms of Jewish personalities. It's so interesting how Mordechai, even though he comes from Benjamin, his father was a Benjaminite, his mother was from the tribe of Judah. But he's called a Judean, and he was part of those exiled by the Babylonians from Jerusalem. Now, there was two exiles. There was the initial exile where Torah scholars and people of stature were exiled, and then the king and the rest of the community were exiled years later. And Mordechai was part of the first exile. So he had been out of the country for a very long time, and it implies that he didn't witness the actual destruction of the temple. He was already in exile in Babylonia. But he's called a Yehudi, which, I mean, technically, I guess you translate as a Judean. Esther, the book of Esther, the Megillah tells us her name was Hadassah, but she's called Esther, and she is from the same family, being that she would be a Benjaminite also. So that would mean that she would be from the children of Rachel, maybe bearing some relationship to Joseph. So we find in the Bible two different Jewish hero personalities. We find Judah and Joseph. What's the difference between these two? What do they represent? Judah was a shepherd. Judah was sent by Jacob to Egypt to establish a house of study. So Judah is the paradigm of the Jew who doesn't engage with the outside world. He stays pure to Jewish tradition and to Jewish faith, and he's primarily, as we said before, he's the person who who is deeply rooted in tradition, both internally and externally. And his approach is to keep a distance, that Jews in exile have to live in their own place, and a distance must be kept. Joseph, on the other hand, accomplishes something that's extraordinary, and it's something that's only for unique individuals. He's completely mixing in. He's at the top echelons of power, and he seems to be, dressed as an Egyptian, and yet he continues to practice his religion, and he continues to deeply and sincerely believe in his faith. And not only that, he promotes his faith from the inside. We find that Joseph prepared a place for his brethren to come to Egypt. We also find that it says that the Egyptian population were transferred from their land and placed elsewhere. And Rashi brings, the sages say, this was to help the integration, or help the children of Jacob not to bear a relationship to the Egyptians as much as outsiders as they would have otherwise. In other words, since everybody was moved around, Egypt became kind of like the United States. Everybody was immigrants. Everybody was in some place new. And so therefore, the Jews who had newly emigrated, they weren't despised in that way, because the relationship between the two groups and classes they weren't so foreign as they would have been otherwise, and the top-down type of relationship didn't exist, because everybody was new. Everybody didn't know the other person. They didn't have relatives that lived there for 1,000 years in that same town. And that's exactly what you have in Europe. In many places in Europe, people live in the same place for a very, very long time. And that was a situation in Eastern Europe. It's interesting, I recently saw a documentary about women in the Ukraine who refused to leave Chernobyl, a place where there's that terrible toxic radioactivity, because their families had lived there for so many generations. And so there was this clear, tight bond between the people and the land, particularly their home, the town where they lived in. And that really that breeds persecution. Because then there's this feeling of this is ours and you don't belong and you're an outsider. And so Joseph preempted that by mixing people up. And so it took a lot longer until the Jews began to be persecuted. So Joseph, from the inside, assists the Jewish people. Externally, he's an Egyptian. In fact, so much so that his brothers completely didn't recognize him. But he hasn't lost the faith of his fathers despite external activity. So that's Esther. Esther, the word Esther comes from the word Hester, which means hidden. Now, Esther with an aleph could allude to hidden. It could also allude to the word astir. I will hide something. So it's somebody who is actively hiding. Esther was actively hiding her background. To such an extent, nobody knew where she came from. Now, it seems, I mean, it's interesting because she grew up in Mordechai's house. So, try to imagine this. She grows up in a Hasidic home or something like that, She grows up in Rabbi Waldy's home, and nobody realized that she was Jewish? How did that happen? How did she do that? So she really, really must have hidden her identity in every way. In other words, culturally, in the way she held herself, the way she talked. She didn't sound like she was from Brooklyn anymore. She changed everything. She changed, evidently. Either that or some divine miracle that despite in whatever way she didn't change, she appeared like she did. Nobody could figure out where she was from. The king didn't know where she was from. Nobody knew where she was from. So it's a fascinating thing, because usually this is not good. I mean, if I would meet a Jew and I didn't know where he was from, I would be disappointed, Meaning to say, I want to see on you, you're Jewish, you know? You should dress like a Jew, you know? I don't know, say Shalom Aleichem, you know? Say hello like a Jew, something. I mean, nothing? It's very not impressive. It's very disappointing, really. So, you know, I can just imagine how Esther was seen by the Torah scholars and the you know, the Haredi element of the day. Oh my gosh, forget it. I mean, Esther must have been, you know, on the outs. I don't even think, I'll tell you the truth, I don't even think the Jewish people knew Esther was crowned king. Meaning to say her name was Hadassah. Nobody knew her as Esther. She hid her identity. I don't think the Jewish community knew it was her. I think they had no idea. Not only that, Mordechai kept her she was very modest, and she wasn't really well known in the Jewish community, even though Mordechai was a leader, but he kept her very quietly at home. And I don't think anybody realized this. I mean, one of the reasons I say that is I think that if some Jews knew about it, Haman probably would have found out about it. He probably would have found out. He probably would have had spies. Somebody would have slipped. So, somebody would have yente. You know what a yente is? You know, somebody would have talked about it. Come on, a Jew becomes a queen. Somebody would have said, that's our little Esther. That's our Esther up there. That's Hadassah. Look what happened to her. Look where she went. One of them would be saying, oy vey, look what happened to our nice Jewish girl. She became the queen of Persia. Now she's eating treif. What happened? The other one would be saying, wow, finally a Jew. Let's put it on the news. Finally a Jew is elected. She's a woman and a Jew elected as a queen. This is really big political news. Let's get it out there. Somebody would have talked about it. Nobody said anything. So you see that nobody knew. Nobody had any idea. She was so Esther. She was so hidden that nobody but Mordechai knew about it. Nobody. Only maybe her close confidants, who were the messengers between Mordechai and Esther, might have known because they were hearing the correspondence. Hasach, who was the person who was the messenger between the two of them, he knew. But besides that, I don't know if anybody knew. So, Esther's faith was so strong. Esther's faith was incredible. Esther, that's why the Megillah is named after Esther, not Mordechai. It's not called the book of Mordechai. It's called the book of Esther. Because she's the real heroine here. And she's actually also the one that's really unique. She's incredibly unique because she's able to engage. She's kind of living in Mashiach. She's living on a level that doesn't have to separate from the hostility. How do you get to such a place? So there are two levels here in terms of a relationship with evil. One is an awareness of evil and a deep outrage to evil and a deep disgust to evil. Now that's necessary, it has to be. But at the same time, when a person's in that place, there's an appreciation of evil and that it has power. And because of that, we have to detest it. Because of that, we have to pray against it. Because of that, we have to fight against it. But then there's another level. There's a much higher level. And that's a level of a God awareness that even evil is coming from God. Even evil is only there. It's very root. And that there's such a strong awareness that evil doesn't really exist except, again, as a tension, except as a tool to bring out God's providence and to bring out God's glory in the world, that it doesn't even disturb the person. They're not even disturbed. They're not even, a hint of their evil inclination is not even stimulated. It doesn't mean a thing to them. That was Esther's level. And that's the level of Purim. Purim is on this level. Why is it on Purim is there so much physical enjoyment? Eating and getting merry and drinking and brought the whole problem. Why are we drinking? How did we get into this whole mess? We got into this mess because the Jewish people went to the party and they were drinking. So here's the thing. We have to start on the level of Mordechai. What's the level of Mordechai? Love of Mordechai is rebellion. Love of Mordechai is to fight. It's to fight against evil. It's not to be afraid of evil. But you recognize that evil has a power. But despite that, person sacrifices himself. Haman is strong, but I'm willing to give up everything to fight him. Even though I know he could defeat me, even I may lose my life, but I'm willing to fight. That's Mordechai. Mordechai knew Haman was powerful. He knew he could be executed, but he refused to bow down. Every human being has to start on that level. We have to start on a level where we're aware of evil. First of all, we got to get aware of evil. I mean, that's the first step. First step is we have to study Torah and know what evil is. That's number one. And then we have to learn to detest it. We have to learn to love the spiritual and detest things that lead a person to sin. Things that are evil in the world. Like I said, and we've been saying that to a certain extent is the body. And that's an extremely complicated thing, and usually people like to say that Judaism is not against physical pleasure, and we're getting to that. The idea is that Judaism is it's not against physical pleasure, but recognize physical pleasure is a problem. It's a real problem. Why is it a real problem? Because it's amoral. Because it doesn't recognize God in the world. That's why. In other words, if I enjoy eating today, I mean, let's give the Jewish example, but it could very well be a Noahide example. Okay, if I gluttonously enjoy food today, tomorrow I might rip off an animal limb, right? Tomorrow a person, God forbid, could eat swine, could eat something that's prohibited from eating because they've already stimulated with abandon the desire to eat. They've given into that. Person's desire to eat doesn't know one level. I mean, it's not a moral impulse. Same thing, somebody seeks a lot of wealth in order to give charity. It's a very dangerous road, that one. It's a lot safer to stay in poverty and never face the threats of wealth, and which brings great arrogance and materialism. But at the end of the day, we need these things. At the end of the day, a person also is unhealthy, not having food and drink and so on and so forth. And clearly, from the Sabbath and the festivals, we see that there's a clear place in serving God with food and drink, but limited and in its place. So, but yet, on Purim, there's this abandon. There's a rabbinic obligation to drink a lot of wine and basically kind of get drunk on Purim. Not to know the difference between blessed be Mordechai and cursed be Haman. We're supposed to drink so much that they kind of lose their ability to discern. They lose their intellect. That seems a little bit inappropriate for a religious person. That's not a religious approach. It seems bizarre. What are they saying here? But that's the level of Esther. Esther is on the level that there's no bad. Meaning to say there's such a clear awareness that even everything in the physical world stems from God, and even the kings that rebel against God are from God, that they're no obstacle. But you can't get to that level, as I said before, until a person gets fully on the level of Mordechai. That's why, first, on the 13th day of Adar, there's a fast day. No food. Repentance, prayer. So the first thing we do is nullify the physical completely. We're ready to have nothing. We're not interested in it. We don't want to touch it. We want only to relate to the spiritual. When we get to that level, fully, God, as a gift on Purim, gives us the next level, which is an awareness on such a level that evil is meaningless completely. We don't have to fight with it. It doesn't even stand in our way. Doesn't mean it's not there physically, but it doesn't act as any type of obstruction to my service of God at all. And on that level, a person can drink and eat and everything, he knows everything is for the service of God. And there's no part of that food, because in his relationship to it, He's not doing it as hedonism. The idea is that there's a certain sensitivity on that day that it's all for the joy of Purim. It's all for the joy of knowing there's nothing but God, even in the hiddenness of the exile. So again, this is really, it's not just like this idea to praise God, but this is very relevant in a person's everyday experience. The point is, as I said, it is how do we confront the evil inclination? This is giving us an incredible counsel of how to meditate. As I said, the first level is to recognize the dangers of evil, to detest it. As the Tanya says, as the first Rebbe of Chabad, one of the Hasidic masters, explains, persons should meditate on God's greatness and realize how these things cut a person off from their true living, their true being. A person realizes that hedonist pleasures cut themselves off from true being. They're going to hate and detest them. Put a different way, a person will hate sin because it cuts them off from God. They're not going to hate sin because it gives them an opportunity to be judgmental of somebody else, but because they realize, see it for really what it is. They see it as something that's cutting off the IV. It's choking them. It's poison. It brings destruction into the world. So that's the first level. So the point is, for example, let's say a person wins the lottery, okay? How do they respond to that event in a way that they can protect themselves from the possible greed and materialism that can develop the arrogance? So they have to start thinking to themselves, they have to think, this money, what is it already? You have to think about, this could be, God forbid, terribly dangerous. This could leave me away from God. This could cause me to be arrogant against my fellow man. This could cause me to get so busy with it that instead of me yearning for God, I'm just yearning for more money. How can I invest it? How can I do with it? So the first approach to the money is to detest it. The second level is after that, because now the person has already created distance, is to realize this money, it came to me only for one purpose. This money was given to me as a messenger of God to use it appropriately. And that's the message of Purim. And we have to work within these two levels. First, complete separation, and then engagement. And everybody has to do these things every single day as well. We have to start our day totally separated for some time in meditation, in prayer and study, to affirmatively state to ourselves, there's nothing but God. And the world, I'm not interested in the world. The world doesn't mean anything to me. Once you've done that, then you can go out into the world and then you say, I walk with God in this world, and everything I come across is God's providence. It's sending me some message and it has some purpose for me in terms of serving God there. There's a question asked on the Talmud. The Talmud says that the reason for the decree of annihilation of Haman was because the Jews enjoyed the party. There's another view, as I said, it's because they bowed to the idol. So the question is as follows. Number one, having pleasure from a meal, even though it's Gentiles, halachically, that's not punishable by death. Why was there a decree of annihilation? And even if you're going to say that the sin was idolatry, it's also not, the punishment is also not death, because that was done on coercion. And even though a Jew is obligated to give his life and not bow to an idol, but if it's done in a situation of coercion, the punishment's not death. So why was there this decree of annihilation? And the answer that the late Rebbe of Lubavitch gives is that it wasn't a decree in the technical sense. It was more of a measure for measure. What does that mean? The Jewish people attended the meal and did these things because they believed in the political power. They believed in the power of Achashverosh. they trusted in him, not in God. They lost the understanding that even if we have to do certain things politically, but those are just things we have to do, go through certain motions and do our part, but God is in control. They lost that. They believe that it's politics and, activism and the king, and our salvation is with the king. If we somehow get in his good favors, that's how we'll have salvation. They put their trust in the king. Once that happened, measure for measure, God said, well, if that's the case, then let's see how you do. In other words, basically what I'm saying is they turned away from divine providence. Once the Jewish people turn away from divine providence, it's extermination. The Jewish people are people of miracles. They can't exist in the world without divine providence. And by abandoning it, that brought about a decree of extermination. The answer to this decree was really brought about by the decree. Paradoxically, it was through the decree that the Jewish people realized how wrong they were, and that Achashverosh would not save them, and actually that trust in him, that really he was their enemy, and that they realized they were totally helpless, and all they could do was pray to God. There was no way. They saw absolutely no salvation. And that was Esther's command to Mordechai. She said, I want you to fast for me 3 days and 3 nights and pray. And Mordechai went and he collected the masses, and from the day of the decree, they studied Torah, and he collected 22,000 young students, and he studied Torah with them, the Talmud says. And that was, again, Mordechai's response. Mordechai's response is there's only the spiritual. The world is a falsehood. It's an illusion. And the only answer is prayer. That's Mordechai. But Esther herself, she went a different approach, and she did engage in sort of political intrigue. But the reason for that is that Esther, as we said, she knew that her very actions she saw her very action as prayer. She never had even the illusion that somehow the king was really the one who could save her. She knew it was really God, but that she understood she was a tool that would bring it about. She had to do something, but that's just because of God's decree. The Midrash says that at the second party, when Achashverosh says, who is this that made this decree? Then initially Esther was pointing her hand at Achashverosh, and she was saying, this enemy, and an angel came and moved her hand away. So the lesson from that is that she detested Achashverosh. She didn't trust Achashverosh. She had no idea if Achashverosh was going to listen to her or not. She knew that Achashverosh also detested the Jewish people. As we said, because of his deep rootedness in hedonism and idolatry, he also wanted to get rid of them because they represented things that they had forgotten. Ideas that went completely contrary to his beliefs. So she had no illusions to the danger that they were in. And she knew that this was a completely up to God what the result would be. He could have just as easily killed her than killed Haman. She had no idea how this was going to come out. But her very actions was a prayer. It's the same idea as we were saying, because to her, there was no obstacle. She didn't see she didn't see Achashverosh and the political establishment as contrary to God, but only as some tools. As the verse says, and the hearts of kings are in the hand of God. And that's how she saw it. And I think that's why the Megillah starts with praising Achashverosh and ends with praising Achashverosh. Because don't forget, on Purim, we see the truth. That whatever the kings do is providence. That we look to the kings to see what God wants. And so we have no problem starting talking about the greatness of Achashverosh, ending with it, because in the end, that's how, in the exile, in secret, in a hidden way, God expresses his providence in the world. I was thinking that maybe that also has something to do with why we start off by saying that Ahasuerus was king over 127 provinces. And it's known that Sarah lived 127 years. So there's two ideas there. First of all, Sarah, our matriarch Sarah, she saw things for what they really were, and she saw Ishmael. What was one of the most famous things about Sarah is that she kicked Ishmael out of the house, right? She sent him away. Why? Because the verse says he was plain. And what does Rashi say? This refers to idolatry. This refers to adultery and murder. So it could be that he committed those things, but there's another approach. It could be he didn't. But she understood that his hedonism and his abandon that he was behaving would lead to those three things, and that's why she kicked him out. So in other words, that the power of Esther, of being against hedonism, is right away hinted to in the beginning of the Megillah, that this was the problem. Immediately alluded to. And, but there might be something else too. And that might be that we know that there's a verse, the verse says that a woman's honor is related to privacy, that there's an element of modesty, which is part of the greatness of a woman in a Torah perspective. And it could be, again, so that's an allusion to God's power of hiddenness. It's a female type of power, right? And we see it right away in the Megillah. There's a reference to Sarah, which was the first matriarch, who represents the revelation of God in the hiddenness. This is a sort of referring to that power of modesty, of being quiet, but yet having tremendous miraculous effect. You know, it's kind of like the male character trait of aggression, being out there, again, the Mordechai, fighting against evil out in the open. And Esther's approach is more subtle. But Purim is about Esther, not really primarily about Mordechai. And it's about God's trait, kind of feminine trait of operating within the hiddenness to bring about miracles. And in a certain sense, that's really a higher level, because an open miracle leaves open a possible contradiction, meaning we could possibly read an open miracle as God can bend the rules of nature, but doesn't necessarily always control it. But a miracle within nature, that teaches us that God is always there, not just when we notice him clearly without question, but even when we don't. So in many ways, that's a higher level. And that's also, interestingly enough, that's true about the two roles of a man and a woman, where the man's role is in the synagogue and reading from the Torah. So it's open and revealed, but there's this other side where there's a slight impression of, well, God's in the synagogue. God is when I study Torah, but then I go to work. While the woman is engaged in the material acts in the home, but everything is to serve God. Everything in the home is infused with fear of heaven. Everything in the home is infused with love of Torah and everything that she's doing. And that really is a higher level. Because although, of course, it's wonderful to study Torah, but there are boundaries. It almost implies that Torah has its realm, the outside has its realm. You know, isn't that what the synagogue, God forbid, implies? There's the synagogue, then there's outside the synagogue. But that's problematic. But the Jewish home doesn't have that. Who you are in the home is who you are. You take that wherever you go. It's not a superficial part of yourself. It's not a communal front. It's who you are. And that's the message of Purim. The message of Purim is an awareness of providence at every moment, in every situation, no matter what, whether he's visible or not. And this clearly is the reason if I may say so, why the sages say that all holidays will be nullified when the Messiah comes except for Purim. That's bizarre. But I think the simple explanation is because the miracles of the Messianic era will be so great that they will pale, the miracles of Egypt will pale in comparison to the miracles of the Messianic age. However, the level of miracles within the hiddenness of the exile, that we'll still have to remember, because that's such a high level. That's a level of God awareness. Even in the hiddenness, we can never forget that. Even when we come to a place where there'll be visible and open miracles once again. So this is our work every single day, to seek out providence in our lives and to seek out the messages from God. And obviously, there's no way to do that without first studying Torah, understanding what God's will is, what it is he wants from us in the world. And then when we go around in the world, as the Baal Shem Tov said, everything is to teach us a lesson. When? If we wanted to. If we want to seek out how to serve God and to gain wisdom, God's wisdom of how to act and how to understand the world, he'll send us the messages. Providence will come and walk with us, but we have to want it. and that's what Purim is all about. Purim is a time of completely losing ourselves because we're completely taken care of no matter where we are and what we're doing. We can get completely drunk and abandoned because even there in that place, God is completely in control. Even there, in a place where we're totally helpless, we can't control ourselves, we're not worried because God is in charge. On Purim, we don't have to mention God because even Achashverosh is only an angel of God. Happy Purim!